Hey everyone, welcome to my channel, and in this video I'm going to be talking about the 2021 roadmap to becoming a web developer. So if you haven't already seen this link, this guy put out some really good information about the different infrastructures and technologies and tools you could use to become a front-end, back-end, or DevOps developer. And my first takeaway from this is that there's too much information on this. You can't just give this link to someone and say good luck. There's just way too much options. It's going to pretty much be information overload. So what I'm going to do in this video is basically boil down and pick out the things that I use in my day-to-day. So every day, maybe there's technologies and tools that I use 80% or 90% of the time. And then every week, I probably use 100% of these tools or technologies. So that's what I'm going to share with you. And those are technologies that have landed me a job and have continued to allow me to have a job for the past 2, 3, 5 years. And before I start talking about the technologies that I have tabs open up all of these, let me just give you a little bit of credibility. I am a web developer full stack. I've been working in the industry since 2013. That's like 7 or 8 years of experience. And just to kind of give you my opinion, like there's various tools that I have never used or got paid for. Like I have never used Electron professionally. I haven't used WebAssembly, Gatsby, Next, Jekyll, Hugo, all these things like I have never actually been paid for. And that's cool, right? You're going to be working on a subset of these tools and languages at your job, and you might have to use them for a couple of years before you can learn anything new. And that's kind of how it boils down. All right, so let's just kind of jump into the tools and technologies that I recommend that you start learning. So to become a web developer, you first need to learn an IDE. So that is an integrated developer environment. So that's just a fancy word for a text editor, right? So the one that I recommend for all beginners is to just learn VS Code. It has tons of extensions that are created from the public that you can install to get different language supports, different plugins for like Python, TypeScript, Docker, Vue, whatever, you name it, it's probably there. And I do really love this editor. I used to use Atom before and I switched over to VS Code, and I'm not going to switch over to anything else for the time being. And when I say learn the editor, I also mean learn all the different shortcuts. So every editor typically has key bindings and shortcuts that you can do to kind of increase your productivity. And I think you should kind of figure out the ones that help you, like Command-Shift-P if you're on Mac to do fuzzy searching, or like Command-Shift-F to do a full project search to find a file or some text in a file that you need. So that is what I mean by download an editor, get good at it, and become really proficient at it, because that's what you're going to be using in your day-to-day. So after you picked an editor, I highly suggest that you pick a language to learn how to program. Okay, so the first thing about web development is you need to know how to program. And you can learn how to program in Python or JavaScript, C#, Java, whatever you want. But you need to learn the fundamentals of like variables, functions, for loops, while loops, iterations, recursion, all that stuff, you name it. You need to become really good at it, because that is also something that you're going to be doing day to day, problem solving, and stuff like that. Now, since you're doing web development, I highly recommend that you learn JavaScript, because you can use JavaScript for your front end if you're using like React or any type of interactive HTML. And you can also use it for the back end if you're using like Node or anything like that. And the resources for learning JavaScript are so abundant. There's tons and tons of JavaScript tutorials. Like there's one right here on Free Code Camp, which I highly recommend, where they kind of just teach you the basics of, how do you do variables, how do you do strings, all that jazz. Just beware, I would not recommend that you learn HTML and CSS yet. Again, just focus on the fundamentals, focus on learning how to program, focus on JavaScript. So after you feel like you have a really good understanding of how to program in a language, and hopefully you picked JavaScript, I do also recommend you get really familiar with using a terminal. So if you're on Mac, you could use iTerm2 or whatever, or you could use the terminal that's built in the VS Code. And what I mean by learn the terminal is you need to be able to easily navigate the folders, set up your bash RC file, be able to use grep, pipe commands to each other, get really familiar with how you do stuff in your command line, because you're going to be doing a lot of stuff with like npm, installing dependencies, maybe doing something with like logs where you need to like SSH into a machine and actually view something on a machine that you can only use the terminal for. So at the start of your journey, get really familiar with using a terminal, because it's going to become invaluable in your web development journey, I guess I should say. Okay, so you've learned how to program, you've learned JavaScript, you know the basics, you're familiar with the terminal. Now what I recommend you do is you learn Node.js. So this is just a runtime that you can use to run JavaScript code to access things like your file system. or do network requests and stuff like that. And there's a really large ecosystem around it. So anything that you can think about building, you can probably find a package on NPM, which we'll talk about in just a second, to achieve that. Now, why I recommend Node over, like, I don't know, Python or any other language is that you can continue to use the exact same language that you can do on the front end. And that kind of reduces the level of entry to become a web developer. Now, again, all these technologies I'm talking about, I use in my day-to-day. We use Node on this project. We use React in the front end, which is also using JavaScript. So I'm not going to recommend any of these tabs of something I don't actually use in my day-to-day career. So again, when I say learn Node.js, I don't mean learn all of these things. You really just need to know a couple of the basics, like FS for file system. URL is really useful if you're trying to, like, you know, parse and decode URLs. But a lot of these things, like, I don't actually use in my day-to-day, but you should kind of have an overview and understand that they exist. And you could use them if you wanted to build some type of lower level programming library or language or something like that. But yeah, all in all, I suggest to learn Node, and that'll really help you drive home your knowledge of JavaScript. So coming hand in hand with Node.js, you're more than likely going to come across something called NPM. So this is basically a repository where people can push all their JavaScript / Node.js code to, and then other people around the world can download it and use it. So as an example, I can type in a library here, and then it'll show me the library. I can search it, get some documentation about how to use it. I can go to the GitHub page, which we'll talk about in a second, and also find the different releases and stuff. And you can basically use NPM to install dependencies in your JavaScript code and then use them. Again, NPM and Node kind of come bundled together. So if you're going to learn Node, you're definitely going to be learning NPM. But just, you know, maybe watch this tutorial about it, learn about the different commands, what a package JSON file is, what the package lock is, how do you install or remove dependencies from your project, stuff like that. Super, super valuable information. So now that you know JavaScript, you know Node, what I am recommending that you do is kind of start focusing on the back end. Now, the back end can be kind of scary and daunting for some people. I personally think the back end is easier, especially when you're starting off, because you don't have to learn HTML, CSS, JavaScript, React, and then all these other things that are involved with it, like Webpack or bundling or parcel. You just have to learn how to write JavaScript, and that's about it. To start off with your back-end path, I guess you could say, you want to learn something called Express.js. This is probably my recommendation. There's others out there, like Happy.js and there's Sales.js, but Express.js is basically a library you can use to spin up servers. Okay, so most of the web, all of the web I should say, is built off of, you know, UIs, whether they're a command line or a web browser connecting to a server to send and retrieve information. Express.js gives you the ability to quickly spin up APIs. And I'm not going to go into details of all this, but it's really easy to get started. You can make a server and you can tell it to listen on a specific port and also listen to various endpoints. So while you're learning Express.js, you probably want to learn about what is a REST API, what is an HTTP request, what are the different methods of HTTP requests, how do you use you know, requests to kind of communicate with the server, vice versa. You could use curl in your command line, or what I recommend at this point is that you probably start learning something called Advanced REST Client. So this is a tool that you can use. I have it installed in this laptop, where basically you can provide it URLs, you can provide it example payloads, and kind of send stuff to your server that you should be trying to play around with and learn, just to see that it works and you get a response back. There's also something called Postman you could try using, or Postwoman, but I enjoy Advanced REST Client because Postman just makes you log in now and all this other stuff. So I don't really recommend it, but if it works for you, it works for you. So since you're taking the back end path first, one thing you're going to have to understand is how do you store data into a database. So there's a lot of different types of databases out there, but the two main ones that I recommend is that you learn SQL, some type of SQL database, and then you learn some type of NoSQL database. Now, when I say learn, I don't mean become an expert at them. I just mean like learn your CRUD operations. How do you create records? How do you remove records? How do you update records? What was the other one? Create. Oh, how do you read? So CRUD is create, read, update, and delete. Learn how to do the basics of those in your database. And Postgres is a really popular open source one that you can easily install and get running. And you can point your Node server. Remember, you learned Express, but now you need to learn how do you use Express to talk to a database. And then you can use Advanced REST Client to hit your server to store items, retrieve items, stuff like that. Now, it's really important to know SQL because a lot of the web is built off of SQL. There has been a slow transition to using NoSQL, and one example of NoSQL is MongoDB. It's another popular one, but I have not been paid to use this. All throughout my career, I've never professionally used MongoDB. But I do think it's a great tool to kind of get your feet wet in learning what NoSQL is and how you could potentially build applications using NoSQL. So if you are really familiar with SQL, or once you've played around with Postgres, I do recommend you also learn how to connect to a MongoDB database from your Express service to also understand all this. Now, with all this being said, these are just tools that I recommend. Again, I use almost all of these except for MongoDB. I don't use that in my career, but all the other ones I have used. And again, you're not trying to become an expert at these tools. You're just trying to learn enough so that if you go into an interview and people ask you questions like, what databases do you know? You're not just sitting there, you're like going, what is a database? Like, you actually need to know this stuff. All right, so let's move on. You learn Mongoose JS, and that is a library that you can use on your Express server to kind of connect to Mongo. There's also one for Postgres that you could use, but I just recommend using this one. There's a lot of MERN stack stuff out there. MERN stands for Mongo, Express, React, and Node. And that is kind of the stack that I'm recommending that you learn when you're becoming a web developer in 2021. So at this point, you should know how to build a backend service that's talking to a database, how to use some type of tooling to communicate with your backend. After you've learned, the basics of that, I highly recommend that you learn Git. So Git is a version control tool that you can use to basically store and save updates of your code. So as a developer, as you're working on your code, it makes sense that you want to save your changes along the way in case you made a giant mistake you need to roll back. That is kind of what version control is used for. And as you're working on a project with a lot of people, like let's say 8 or 9 developers, and they're all touching the same code base, you need these type of toolings to allow you to kind of become really productive and keep track of all the changes and be able to merge changes together. So definitely recommend Git. Read a tutorial about it, watch a video about it, and once you've done that, that's when you probably should go over to GitHub and create a GitHub account so you can start playing with free Git repos. So on GitHub, you can go here, you can create a repository where you can clone to your local laptop and start playing around with it. That's what I put all of my YouTube code into. So I have a YouTube repo here. And whenever I'm done recording a video that's related to a tutorial, I just go ahead and make a new folder and I push some code to this repo so that everyone else across the world can view it, right? So you learn how to do a server, you learn how to communicate with the database, you learn how to communicate with your server, and now you're storing your code so you can later retrieve it or share it with the world. Now, the final step of like the back-end path is you need to learn how to deploy your server, right? All the work that you've been doing from now has probably just been something locally, right? How do you host your server locally? But at some point, you actually need to push that code to a server or a service and have it hosted for other clients to be able to connect to. So if you're a beginner, I highly recommend that you use Amazon EC2. If you sign up, they give you, I think, a free year to kind of play around with maybe like a nano-sized box. And this is just a VM that you can kind of SSH into, spin up your server, host it, and play around. And it's really good to get familiar with how do you do that type of stuff. Because if you just, let's say, use something like Heroku to host your application, you aren't learning how to actually like do anything on bare metal. Okay, so what I mean by that is if you're a beginner, it's always better to, I think, learn how the underlying technologies work before you start using services to make your job easier. Sign up for Amazon. It's a huge company with a lot of services that you can learn and use. So the main reason I recommend Amazon is because that is what I use at my day-to-day, but also I think a lot of other people use it as well. So if you go into an interview and you say, hey, I host my web UI on S3 and I host it behind a CloudFront distribution, and then I also have Route 53 that's pointing my domain to that distribution, and then for my backend I'm using Amazon Lambdas to run my serverless application, and then that's hosted behind API Gateway, and again I have a Route 53 endpoint that's pointing my API domain to that. I think that's just going to be a selling point in terms of like how do you sell yourself and your skills. So I would think sign up for a free account, start playing around with some of the tools like EC2, S3 serverless, and just get a basic understanding of how you can use these. All right, so that was pretty much the full backend path. You know how to do a lot of stuff with the backend at this point. Now what I recommend you do is you could probably start looking for backend jobs if you wanted to, but again, if you can learn more about how the full stack web development process works, I would recommend you do that. So now you can start moving on to the front end stuff. So the first thing I'd recommend doing is learning about HTML and CSS. And those are just two languages that you can learn to basically structure web pages and style them. And you could spend a couple of days or weeks, or I'm still honestly learning CSS because it's such a beast and confusing to learn sometimes. But as long as you know some of the basics of like, how do you create a form, or how do you style a form, or how do you make how do you make a 3-column grid or something like that, I think you'll be in a good position. Like learn CSS grid or maybe Flexbox or something like that for positioning. And once you have a basic understanding of that with CSS and HTML, I think you're good to move on to the next step, which is how do you use JavaScript to add interactivity to my web pages. All right, so as an example, if I were to click on this drop down, that potentially could be using JavaScript to show this div dynamically, and as I unclick it, it goes away. So you probably know what I mean by adding interactivity to a web page. Basically, all the JavaScript things that you've learned while trying to learn the backend can also be applied to your web browser to do interactivity, to do cool stuff. So that's the next step. And again, there's so many tutorials out there that are free code camp. There's tons of YouTubers who make videos about this. There's free Udemy courses and whatnot. So I don't feel like you need to pay a ton of money to like understand and learn this stuff. Just find some courses, learn the basics of it, and then move on to the next thing. So once you feel comfortable with the knowledge that you have for HTML and CSS, and maybe your little bit of JavaScript you're using to make it connect to, I don't know, let's say your backend API that you created, I would suggest moving on to something more advanced like React. So React is a library, or you could call it a framework, I guess, that gives developers a kind of structure of how they can build reactive websites. So if you've done any type of work with vanilla JS, so just normal JavaScript, it becomes really, really hard to build websites that become large. So React and Angular and Vue and Svelte, they all kind of give you a lot of tools to be able to quickly build websites that are kind of changing and dynamic in nature. And I recommend using React because I think it's still one of the biggest libraries that's out there that's used by people, followed by I think Angular, and Vue is also really nice as well. But I use React professionally full time, so if that's the thing that pays my bills, I recommend that you learn it as well. All right, so once you now know how to build a front end and you know how to build a back end, I suggest you start learning something about authentication and authorization, and more specifically, I suggest you learn JWT. This is just one tool you can use for authorization, sorry, not authorization, for authentication. And it could be kind of confusing to learn at first, but there's a lot of videos out there as well that kind of explain it. So I recommend you learn this and you try to apply it to whatever you're building. So make sure you can build a front end that can use some type of auth that connects to a back end. And that's the main goal. You should be able to build like a full stack application and get it deployed before you actually start getting serious about applying for jobs, in my opinion. So once you learn about authentication, authorization, how it kind of works, then I recommend that you start learning some more like higher level software engineering tools of the trade, I guess you could say. So in this case, I recommend testing. You want to learn how to do unit testing, you want to learn how to do integration testing, and you want to learn how to do end-to-end testing. So if you are using Node, which I recommend you use, or JavaScript, there is something called Jest you can use to kind of write your unit tests, but you kind of need to understand what a unit test is, what integration test is, how you can use them to kind of verify your software is working the way you want it to. And once you have a good understanding of testing in general, also there's Cypress. This is another tool you can use. Basically, it loads up a web browser and you can tell it to start clicking on things and verify that things get loaded. This is like an end-to-end test or a functional test, so you'd want to learn how to use Cypress to do that. We also use this at our job. So again, once you learn unit testing, integration testing, and end-to-end testing, I think you're in a really good position to kind of talk about those ideologies when it comes to being interviewed. So once you've finished building out your website, you're going to want to be able to deploy it somewhere, and there's a ton of static hosting services out there. One of them that is really easy to use is GitHub Pages. You could basically build your React app and push it to a branch in your repo, since you know how to use Git by now, and it'll just host it for you automatically. And all you could do is you could basically point your application to your Express app that's running somewhere, and then you have a full stack that is kind of deployed and working. All right, so the very last thing I want to talk about is CI/CD. So that is another higher level software engineering term, which means continuous integration and continuous deployment or delivery. And basically what this means is as you have a team of software engineers who are pushing code to a repo, it's going to build your code and test your code and publish your code out to be deployed and used by the public. Or maybe from an internal team that's going to do testing on your QA code, you know? But I think it's really important to come into an interview and understand how some basics of CI/CD, like how it works, why you want to use it, maybe even be able to talk about this one instance where you use Circle CI to connect to your open source full stack application, and you deployed your UI to GitHub pages in Circle CI, and you also deployed your backend to Amazon EC2 via a Circle CI runner or something like that. So I know there's a lot of information. There's a ton of stuff that you can learn, but I do recommend, these are the tools in the path that I recommend that you take in this order to become a full stack web developer in 2021. And there's a lot of other bonus terms and keywords that you should probably learn, like what is Webpack, what is a bundler, what is Docker, what is containerization. But I think if you learn all of these, the things that I showed you, you'll be in a really good position to maybe land a job and kind of talk through any type of questions someone might give you for like a junior software engineering position. And again, don't feel like you need to know all this before you start applying for jobs. But if you have a good understanding of all this, I don't see why someone wouldn't hire you. All right, so that wraps up my little talk. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Cody Seibert, and this channel is Web Dev Junkie. If you have any comments, questions, or concerns, be sure to paste them in the comment section below, and be sure to subscribe if you're new to this channel, and be sure to like this video if you thought it was useful for you. All right, good luck and happy coding.